Thank you for persisting with me, because it broke my heart that I couldn't contribute to the Belvedere Research Center conference before. And I'm very humbled, extremely humbled to be part of such a prestigious event, and an important event as well. An event that resonates so importantly in this year and in this moment around such disruption, such heartache, such change, such reorientation, such reframing for not just our sector, but the very concept of what a museum and an art museum may need to be as we step forward into this moment after COVID. I'm grateful to not just all the speakers we've heard so far this afternoon, who have so eloquently set the stage, set the table already for this conversation, but for all of the speakers. And looking through the program for the next 5 days, it's spectacular. The talent, the diversity of identities and faces and organizations, career points, types of institutions. And I hope different perspectives as well, that we have that confidence to engage, to critique, to debate, because that's how our sector will move on. And that's how our subject will move on. And I know that we'll always do that with that wonderful characteristic that museology, museum studies always has, which is that collegiality, that sense of us being an ensemble, that sense that we come from so many different disciplines, we come from so many different academic backgrounds and scholarly subjects, but together we make this discourse around museum technology, around museum studies. I'm always delighted and so pleased by how generous and collegial our subject is. And I know that's what we'll see through this conference. So thank you for being here this evening, and thank you for engaging and making that commitment over these next few days. It's important. I'm going to just share a few slides with you now. 2020. When we write the history of museum technology again, and some of us have tried to write it for its first half century, but when we come to write that history of the first 100 years of museum technology from the 1960s through to the middle of this century, this year will loom large. This date will be hard to avoid, will be hard to miss. We won't be able to write a narrative about the relationship between museum and technology without pausing at some point in that historical narrative and reflecting upon what happened in that particular day. Now, what happened for you may be very different from the person that you speak to at this conference this week. You may have been in an organization where this was an extraordinarily efficient moment for your organization to utilize its capabilities around digital and to pivot at scale and at speed to new channels, new platforms, to existing competencies that you already had in your organization, switching to channels that were already there, deploying digital collections that were already in existence, utilizing the literacy and confidence of your staff. That may have been your 2020. It could have been a story of how that investment and time and that journey around digitalization enabled you to continue, enabled you not to miss a beat and to serve your audiences, perhaps in some of the exciting ways we've already heard in the papers this afternoon. Maybe you're in an organization where this was the moment to change, was the moment to transform, was the moment to finally make that commitment, to see staff using digital pervasively, to make that full strategic turn towards digital at an executive level. So rather than seamless pivoting, maybe this was a year of finally needing expediently, out of necessity, because of the emergency, because of the urgency, having to change. But equally, you might be an organization that found this year not just hard, but impossibly so. Maybe yours was an organization that hasn't been ready for digital. that it was always something that other organizations did. That collection never quite got digitized. That director never really quite bought into what the computer could do for the institution. That museum website never quite made it in from the periphery in terms of its significance for the strategy of the organization. That commitment and resourcing of staff development never quite enabled everyone in the organization to feel comfortable with technology. And for those institutions, this has been an extraordinarily difficult year, as well as having an existential crisis about whether the institution has the resource to continue. Added to that was just the difficulty of not having the practices and processes, the tools to be able to work in a digital way. So as we carry on talking about museums and the art museum in a digital age, and as we see it in the context of COVID-19 this week, let's remain mindful that every museum's had its own journey through these last 12 months or so, that every museum will have its own profile of digital confidence, and that will impact on the assumptions we can make when we're having these discussions. And I'm sure we'll remind ourselves on that empathy that we'll need to show. 2020 is a tragically apt and appropriate title for a year that has caused so much reflection. It seems to be like some cruel joke that the very term 2020 that is about acuity and being able to see things with such clarity and focus and balance was the year when everything seemed to come out of focus, where everything started to blur, when actually things started to narrow in our vision of what we could do and what our capabilities were. But let's take ownership of that metaphor, and let's say that actually 2020, that year that we've just worked our way through, could also be the year where we remind ourselves of the long view, when we remind ourselves of the power of acuity, academic acuity around our practice. That actually that visuality, that joke and that trope around seeing that 2020 reminds us of, actually that's a way of us empowering ourselves to say, let's look back. Let's see what we can understand about our digital confidence. Let's have 2020 vision on the relationship between museums and technology, because this year, more than any other year, we need that. What I'd like to do over the next 35 minutes or so is make a case for 3 ways in which I think it's important for us to recognize maturity in digital within the museum, within the art museum. There has been this turn to digital in 2020, whether it's that organization that could work at scale at pace, whether it's that organization that saw this as the moment to need to transform, or whether it's that organization where the shortcomings in its digital confidence were exposed. For whatever organization it is, wherever they are in their digital journey, this is the year where we had a turn to digital. But I'd like to make a case that we should be careful in our vocabulary and in our analysis and in our summaries and framing of this year, that we don't overstate how much was put in place this year. Let me make that clearer. I think that for the turn to digital to have been so successful for so many institutions this year, we already needed the digital turn to have been in place. For us to use digital so effectively this year, when we needed to switch channels, switch platforms, have a new distributed relationship with our audiences, distributing collections to distributed users with a distribution of expertise, that model wasn't invented this year. That isn't the consequence of COVID. In fact, the story of us being ready for this year goes back 50 years. And maybe I've got the luxury and the privilege over the next half hour to just remind us of that, just to set another background, just to set another context for the papers that we're going to hear and enjoy, and the research, the leading edge research that we're going to engage with over the next few days. So I'd like to suggest that there are three things. That one way we can understand the digital turn, that confidence around technology in the museum, one way is to see it in a critical way, is to see that what has developed over these last 50 years is an intellectual confidence, is an ability to theorize, is an ability to leverage scholarship and academic thinking within the context of computing within the museum. So one thing we need to acknowledge is that critical maturity that's taken place, that was ready, waiting for us in this last year, for us to deploy and make some confident steps and changes to who we are. There's another maturity though, an institutional maturity. Over the last 10 years in particular, we've seen organizations start to really control and own their sense of how digital is embedded within who they are as an organization. We hear Christian's calling of the post-digital in his opening address, and it's, you know, it's a term that speaks to that maturity of digital in the institution. It's not the museum after digital. The post-digital is when we're in a different relationship with digital. We're no longer at the beginning. We're no longer at the adoption stage. We're no longer at the moment of it being new, the shock of the new. It's the moment when digital is innate and embedded. It's part of the lives of our audiences, part of the lives of our staff and the workers in the museum, and it starts to become a function of what museum is. That's the post-digital museum. It's managed normatively within the operations of the museum. So let's acknowledge that institutional maturity in this conversation as well. But let's start by thinking about an operational maturity. I'm interested also in us just reminding ourselves of another journey, perhaps a journey that can be best revealed in just our use of vocabulary and just our use in words. And what I'd like to do is to tell the story of one word. I'd like to tell the story of user and digital user, because I think if we just look at how that word user has been thought about over the last 50 years, what we start to notice is, or what we can see is one of our dimensions, one of our axes of digital change. Let me explain what I mean. If we look back at the 60s, that moment that in a European context at least, we start to see technology coming into the museum for the first time. If we look at the manuals, the documentation, the institutional writing and reports, the academic discourse, even the popular descriptions of computer in the museum, what we see is we hear that word user being used in a very specific way. Go back to those manuals in the 70s that first told us how to use the computer in the art museum, and you'll see that the focus was on automation. It was about getting those art collections digitized, or at least getting the records in place. And remember, our story, certainly in a Northern Hemisphere and possibly even European and North American context, our story of museum technology begins with the art museum. It begins with the Museum Computer Network. It begins with, you know, conferences happening in New York in the art museum, and art curators in the room, saying those words for the first time around what automation could mean for the art museum. That first endeavor through the 60s and 70s was about how the machine could help us to be more efficient. It was about systems and processes. It was about how the user was someone who operated the computer. In that regard, in that construction, the the individual, the person has no identity. They're just a generic user. They are actually part of the system. They're part of the wiring diagram, pulling the levers, putting in the cards, pulling out the tape, keying in the data, and so on. But if we jump to the 80s and 90s, if we jump to the generation after that, we see the user presented in a very different way. Suddenly, museum practice and museum discourse, so what's happening with curators in the museum, but also what's happening with scholars, is that language around user starts to acknowledge that that is a person, that that's actually an individual. So we move from a discourse around efficiency and process to one around accessibility, that I may have very different needs because of a visual impairment or because of the language I speak or personal preference I may have over an interface. Suddenly, we start to think about the interactions rather than the functions. We're interested in the user experience rather than the operational effectiveness of the machine. What we were seeing was a maturing within that relationship between technology, digital technology, the computer, and the art museum. Suddenly, people were not just this generic input-output device, a part of the system. Suddenly, our practice for 20 years begun to look at that person as a unique individual and realizing that they are someone outside of the system. That was a maturing. That was a key moment of maturity within technology's role within the museum. But then let's reflect on the last 10, 20 years. If we think now about how we write about the user, it's not that generic person who's automating an efficient system. It's not even that individual whose needs we need to design for as they use the system. Now, our work, think about your own collections, think about even the papers we've heard so far this afternoon. Suddenly that person is part of the world. They are active in the world. Our watchword is no longer automation or personalization. It's about empowerment. We're interested in the agency that they may have with digital content out within a wider world. This isn't about process or usability. This is now about affect and emotion. How do they feel? How do they operate within a network and a community of other people? This isn't about the operational effectiveness of the machine or the experience of the individual. Now our interest is in the social value of what that digital content can do. Across those three areas, across those three moments, we see the user moving from being, operator to in the 1980s and 90s to individual, to today we might say, well, we might say citizen, we might say actant, but that user has developed. Think about your own practice. Think about your own institution. Think about the academic articles you read. Think about the research that you can locate in those different times. Think about government policy. Think about what the industry's saying. Think about the way we've spoken to each other across this period. And we see that word user evolving. Its meaning has changed. Its resonance has changed. Its implications have changed. That is a maturing within the museum sector. That is our operational maturity, from thinking about what is useful to thinking about how we use the technology to now thinking about it being purposeful. It sits actually within some interesting contexts. If we step back, we shouldn't be surprised by that maturity, that narrative journey that we've been on over that last half century. Whether it's within management studies, whether it's within technology studies, or whether it's even sociological and disability studies, you can see similar moments of movement, similar transitions, similar progresses and maturities that have taken place over the same time. So our operational maturity is a story of the art museum becoming more confident with digital way before 2020. But it's also a reflection of society changing, of our intellectual and philosophical informants changing, of the academy changing, of the market and business changing as well. So our first story of maturity and operational maturity. Let's think about institutional maturity. This is about our organization's relationship with digital and its ability to talk about, but actually manage digital has changed over this period as well. I'm going to draw quite a lot in the next 10 minutes or so from a project called One by One. So One by One is a project that has, over the last 3 years, formed an international multi-partner collaboration, which Christian very kindly referred to in the opening. We're an ensemble of academics, of cultural creatives, technology companies, of cultural organizations, museums and art museums, funders, importantly, policymakers, but also professional bodies and agencies, whether our national museum associations or other sector support agencies. So we have created a growing research collaboration. It's collegial, it's open. We source funding that allow us to use a research idiom, so a kind of investigative mindset and a learning mindset to allow us to look at different stories of digital change and digital transformation around the world. We started by looking at the UK. We've spent the last year and now have funding for the next 2 years to research in the US, and we have conversations going with museums associations and other parties around the world. So do please get in contact with me if you want to find out more about getting involved in One by One. We take an action research approach to local needs, to understand what's needed in any given national or community context, professional context. And then we together bring the expertise together to help us understand what needs to take place and what could take place. And then we share those results and those insights with the rest of our network. It's collegial, it's open, it's non-competitive, it's diverse, it brings together public, private and non-profit organizations. And it's a formidable way of working in the 21st century, and we're very excited by it. So the project One by One is what's been framing some of the work that you're about to hear around. So the institutional maturity that One by One has been charting and understanding hangs on 3 very, very important words. That institutional maturity has come from the museum sector understanding that context matters, understanding that it needs to take a holistic approach to digital change, and recognizing that its use of digital technology needs to be purposeful and driven by social purpose and not just a means to an end. Let me just explain what I mean by each of those in a slightly playful way. So what our work is showing, what you can see played out in different national settings around the world, is that for a museum to develop its digital confidence, it can't follow a single playbook. There's no silver bullets. There's no list or 10-step plan for becoming digitally confident. The breakthrough idea of the last few years is each institution needs to decide upon its own pathway to digital maturity. It needs to set its own goals. It needs to recognize that the place where it starts from will be different from the museum next door and so many others. And we know that. We know museums are different in size. They're different in governance. They're different in resource. They're different in funding. They have different subject matters. They have staff with different capabilities and experience around digital. They sit within different policy shells in different countries. Even the digital infrastructure in different parts of the world is different, or even across a country. For all those reasons, as well as the fact that each museum has had a very different history over the last 50 years with technology, for all those reasons, we can't write a single plan of how a museum can become digitally confident. What we can do is help each museum on its own terms to define and to articulate and plan for its own journey. That's why our project's called One by One, because the museum sector will become more confident with digital, one museum at a time, one person at a time, one by one. So that technique of trying to find your own pathway, we've been developing various tools. I won't dwell too much on it, but I just want to give you a little glimpse of something that's starting to come from the project. We help each museums by, we give out decks of cards, and in a very analog, physical, equitable way, we have the kind of the physicality of not thinking about technology, but just starting to focus on really primary questions around what is digital in your organization, what are you trying to do with it, and where in your organization might you need to develop your use of technology. So we play with these cards, and these cards look very simplistic, they look very playful, they look like a game, and that's a way of bringing people in who may be scared or may feel uncomfortable with technology. But sitting behind these concepts on the cards are some extensive and deep scholarship and research based on our work over the last 3 years. So these cards help you to think about what is digital. Simple question, really, but actually we can't have a meaningful, consistent conversation as a sector, or we can't provide a unified front to our funders and to government and policymakers. We may not even be able to organize our strategy internally if we don't have clarity and consistency with our terminology. So one of the things we've been working very hard on is thinking, what does digital mean within the context of the art museum and the museum? We looked at literacy frameworks from banking and leisure and medicine and scholarship and learning from around the world, 60 different literacy models. And actually we've distinguished ourselves from them, and we've come up with a framework that we think speaks to what digital means for museums. In our workshops and interviews and focus groups and test events, this is what came out. Digital is something you use. So on the one hand, digital is a tool. It's a piece of software. It's a piece of hardware. So when we talk about digital, it's a thing that you use. But digital is also something you manage. It's a strategy. It's a process. It's a system in place within your organization. We do digital in our organization. Where are we with digital? I am head of digital. In that regard, you're not referring to the hardware and software. You're referring to the provision. You're referring to the activity. You're referring to the business processes. And in the museum sector, we would do well, and we do well when we differentiate between those two. But for museums, digital is also something we create. We have digital collections. We have born digital content. We create digital things, whether it's podcasts or interactive games or social media content or online provision. We are digital producers, digitally born objects, digital surrogates, digital records and data and metadata, but also digital content, exhibitory, learning resources that we create. So digital is also those items, that stuff. But museums are there for society. Museums reflect upon society. They reflect society. And so digital is not just a tool to use, not just a thing to manage, not just a thing we create, but digital is also a concept we understand in the museum. We want to understand our place within a digital society. We want to know what it is to be a digital organization. And actually, we want to curate digital. We want to collect digital culture and digital heritage. And that's quite distinctive for the museum sector compared with other industries and other sectors. Anyway, a sign of our institutional maturity is our ability to be able to separate and differentiate digital in that way. Let's turn the red cards over, just turning that red deck in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen. This is a technique that helps us to understand why would we want to develop digital. Well, you can differentiate between wanting to develop your competency. So that's what you can do with a computer. So this is my competency in carpentry is I know how to use a hammer and I know how to use a saw. That's my competency. So in digital terms, I know how to write a tweet. I know how to put a record into a collection management system. But my capability is what I can achieve with digital. So in our carpentry metaphor, this isn't just knowing how to use a hammer. This is, I know how to make a chair or a stool. in digital terms, this is not just being able to write a tweet, but this is actually being able to successfully manage a social media channel for an art museum. That's the difference between a competency and a capability. And again, one by one is helping museums to differentiate, separate that out, being more precise and nuanced so that you know what it is you're trying to do with digital. Are we trying to build our competencies or our capabilities? Or is it our literacies? Our literacy is not our ability to use a hammer and nails. It's not our ability to make a chair, but it's actually our ability to step back and think, should I have made a bench or actually a bed? Your literacy in digital terms in the museum is not just being able to write the tweet or to manage a social media channel effectively. It's your ability as a museum practitioner, as a museum leader, to step back and say, do we need social media in our organization? Or are we using social media effectively? Should we be moving our resourcing of social media around? Do we have enough expertise in our organization that really understands the significance of social media for the museum? That reflection, that being ability to consider rather than achieve and do, that's your literacy. We've never really had a framework like this that's helped us to separate it out. But what it enables us to do is not only say what is digital and why do we need to develop digital, but let's turn our blue cards over here as well. It also helps us to be more precise about where in the organization do we want to use and develop digital. Because you are many different things. As you sit here this week as a practitioner from a conference, a practitioner from an art museum, or an academic from a university, as you think about these conversations around digital change, you're constantly moving between different frames of reference. You're thinking about how this applies to you. You know, do I know how to use Zoom? Am I going to be able to share my screen? Am I going to be able to mute my microphone and unmute my microphone in time? All of those things. That's you as an individual and your competencies and capabilities. But then you have a role in your organization, and it's about the competencies and capabilities and literacies that are relevant to your professional role, your job description, the thing that you're required and asked to do at work, or that your team may want to do. But then what about your network, your community of practice? Me and other lecturers in museum technology, you and other directors of a museum, you and other conservators, you and other registrars and documentation assistants, you as an education officer, you within that distributed community of practice. Maybe there's something your network, your community needs to develop, and that's where your digital need is. Or maybe it's within the whole sector. Maybe it's the whole of our industry needs to reflect on something around digital and be collegial and collaborative and joined up and strategic together to collectively work on museum technology. But then you're also an individual within society. You're a citizen that's part of all of these elements and factors that play upon us within our day-to-day lives, government policy, change in the computing market, and so on. So we need to get better. And this is part of our maturity. This is what One by One is doing. And this is what we're doing with museums, is we're helping them to have this spectrum that allows them to be more precise about not just what part of digital do we need to develop and why, but whereabouts are we talking? Are we talking about the whole institution? Just my team? Just me? Me as a citizen? Me as a professional within my network? It's fun because it allows you to start building combinations of things. It can, maybe you're an individual that needs to develop your competency of, using particular technology. Maybe you just think, I just need to learn how to use Photoshop. Okay, so this is a way of now helping you to get to that realization. Or perhaps you're someone who's in an organization, you're leading an organization, and your thought is actually, as an organization, it's our ability to manage digital that we need to be more precise on. We need to get a collections management system or a content management system together. So we as an organization need to develop that capability to manage collections. It's that part of digital. Or maybe you're a community of practice. Maybe you are education officers and learning officers in art museums across Austria and across Europe. and you're thinking, actually, as a set of learning practitioners, as a set of educationalists, we need to change. We need to understand much more about what digital culture is doing to young people and how they learn, and the shape of education within schools, in formal learning, but also in informal settings as well. Just by using 3 cards, 3 colors, 3 questions, we can start to be more precise. But just stepping back from all of that, the reason I'm sharing that with you, not just because it's fun to share with you and I'd like you to know about it, but it's also because that in itself is an indication of our maturity, that growing maturity within the sector, that we start to understand now that contextual, that importance of taking a contextual perspective. Equally, we're understanding the importance of taking a whole organization perspective. Gone are the days when an organization would think about becoming more digitally confident just by sending staff on a course, or thinking that the problem was with the competencies of staff members. You know, that's why you're at this conference, you know that for an organization to be digitally confident, to be that post-digital art museum, to be digitally mature, it has taken a whole organization perspective on technology. This is what I mean by that. It's these 5 areas. It means your organization knows that the vision you have for your organization, that's the immediate and most important way that you can prioritize digital for your art museum. If it's there in the very highest articulation of what your art museum is, everything becomes a lot easier. You give permission across your organization to think in a digital way. If you say your art museum is reaching out to audiences around the world, etc., etc., within that statement, even though you haven't used the word technology or digital, you're making an assumption about being in a network age. So you're giving permission to your organization to think in network terms, to think digitally. That's so important. If digital is in the grammar of the organization, the self-articulation of the institution, that is a huge stride forward to digital maturity. But your organization needs to have leadership that then activates digital. It may be there in the strategy, but that executive team needs to lead by example. It needs to model great behavior with digital. But then the other side of leadership, we all need to be leaderful in our work. We all lead digital, whatever part of the organization we're in the way that we show the people around us our confidence with digital. So it's leadership that activates digital confidence within the institution. The processes enable it, the strategies, the systems, the protocols, the policies, they're the things that enable everything to happen. So they all need to be in place as well. And they need to be digitally minded, digitally ready. They need to assume that you're a digital organization. But the culture you create, the vocabulary you use, the behaviors you show, the atmosphere you set, the opportunities that you create for experimentation and creativity, that whole culture around digital matters as well, because that's what will support and continue to support the organization as it becomes more and more digitally confident. As long as you remember that people are key. If you look after your staff, empathize with your staff, be mindful of their needs, be aware when they may feel precarious, particularly at a time of COVID emergency. Think about the emotional labor that goes with seeing through digital change. Recognize that each member of staff is on their own journey of digital change. Acknowledging that as well is key. So, we have our holistic view now of digital. All of those things help us to use digital, to manage digital, and so on. A final comment, and then just to move into our last kind of area of maturity, being purposeful as well. Our institutional maturity is not just about understanding how we frame our own pathway and how we think holistically about technology across our own organization. But the digitally mature institution, the one that's showing institutional maturity around technology, is one that has reconciled the relationship between technological change and social purposefulness. Let me explain what I mean by that. On the one hand, in the museum sector, we've been working on digitalization. We've been becoming digital organizations, using digital tools in a business-like way, very technocratic and efficient way. And we've become, digital organizations. Meanwhile, we've also started to think more and more in the last 20 years about being a socially purposeful museum, about understanding the responsibility we have in the modern world to speak to issues and causes and rights, that we think about participation, we think about democracy, we think about social justice. Whatever type of organization you are, you think about your social role and how you are seen in society and what you do for society. What we need to do, and what the digitally mature museum is doing, is one that now justifies and drives its digital change, not just for the sake of being digital, but because it enables the institution to meet its social mission. Furthermore, this socially purposeful work happens now within an organization that has become more digitally confident. So what could that socially purposeful museum now do? Now it knows it can use digital channels and platforms and tools. Furthermore, that socially purposeful work needs to understand, and now understands, that the society that it's trying to be purposeful within is itself becoming more digital. So our digital transformation is becoming more socially purposeful, and our work that is socially purposeful is being informed by digital transformation. The technology becoming more social, the social becoming more technological or technologically informed. So rather than social purposefulness and digital transformation, we call this being digitally purposeful. And our mature art museums, our mature digital art museums, are not just contextual in their thinking around digital, they're not just holistic, but they're thinking in a digitally purposeful way. Those are all examples that have come by one, and you can read our reports and you can read our papers and do listen to our podcast, People Change Museums, number of episodes there where you can sort of hear us working our way through these ideas. So I encourage you to find out more. So one gives us a really good insight into that institutional maturity. Okay, operational maturity, seeing the organization just in its way that it conceptualizes user, moving from an idea of automation to personalization to now, ideas around agency, from an operator to an individual to now an actant, something that was part of the system, outside the system, to now in the world. Institutional maturity, post-digital museum, thinking holistically, thinking purposefully, thinking contextually around technology. Just to end, I'd like to just reflect upon one final area that I think represents this digital turn that museums have been on for 50 years, that readied them, that prepared them for the turn to digital in 2020. And that's critical maturity. I think there's something really interesting when we look at the story of museums using technology. We learn not just about a sector and an industry and an institution that's becoming more confident with technology, but we actually, if we look carefully enough and we listen carefully enough, what we also see is a story of museums' relationship with society. Let me explain what I think and what I'm thinking here. If we think about those early days, the 60s and 70s, maybe even into the 80s, the relationship between the museum and technology was very much framed, at least in a European context. And I need to do that more and more in this discussion and in other discussions. We need differentiated, varied stories of museums and technology, and not just a Eurocentric, Anglophone story of museum technology, which we have at the moment. But if we were to look at that European story of museums and technology that starts in the 60s through the 70s into the 80s, it's very much framed in a modernist philosophical mindset. This is about order. This is about production. This is about efficiency. This is about classification. This is about building systems. This is about harnessing the wonders of the new industrial age and allowing them to inform how we construct thought and create a creative industry. It's about the digital museum, the museum becoming a digital thing. So the big question, in the second half, or in the middle to the third quarter of the 20th century, was about how can we order this efficient database. It's a real classic modernist kind of agenda, and it was sincere. It was that modernist sincerity that said, we can do this, we can fix this, we have the solution, we can complete and finish this. We can do this in a total way. We have the ability and technology and knowledge and industrial strength to allow us to define this efficient database, the catalogue. Then if we think about the last 10 years of the 20th century, the web came along and it disrupted our notion of what museum was, because suddenly the museum only existed on the screen. The museum was now made of digital things. The museum was a thing that came to me at home rather than I went to. The museum reassembled itself on a daily basis through on the rectangle of my computer screen. The museum was asking me to have a gallery experience, an exhibition experience in my own environment. The museum was inviting other people to curate exhibitions rather than the curator. The museum was bringing together content from many different places and assembling them on the fly, mashing them up, remixing them in different ways, when before it had been the place where things had been selected judiciously and curated. So we had a dilemma, we had a crisis, we had a series of debates and uncertainties around what the web and digital and the network would mean for the museum at the end of the 20th century, even going into the 21st century. It was classic postmodernist critique. Suddenly we were presented with the image, the representation. We were doubting what was true. We were thinking, how can an illusion or an illustration be real and authentic? Those were our questions. And we started to play with that. We started to reconcile that maybe that representation, the virtual museum, could still be a museum. We knew it wasn't the same as the museum, but we called it so. So it was an almost ironic representation of the museum. But then that irony, in a good postmodern way, started to gain value in itself. But then let's think about where we are now. As the 21st century hits its 21st birthday and gains maturity, and we move from not a modernist moment or even a postmodernist, but we might even say a meta-modern context. We're seeing the museum now reconcile and be comfortable with its multi-channel nature. The museum doesn't wring its hands and worry that its website may not be real, and these are only pixels, and it's not Clint's The Kiss, it's actually a pixelated representation. We've thought that through. Our audiences have the literacy, the media literacy to cope with that. We enjoy the fact that The Kiss exists in different formats, in many different places, in different shapes and media. And all of those things collectively are The Kiss. We no longer see this as a threat. We no longer see this as a weakness or a shortfall, an impoverished museum experience. Our 21st century media literacy, us as curators, us as academics, and our audiences and our industry, has reconciled how media and digital and representation and screen can be part of a trusted, authentic, real, efficient, powerful cultural experience. So in that classic meta-modern way, we've reconciled that sincere effort of the database and the playful critiquing of the ironic website. And what are we doing now? We're building communities. We're reaching out to campaigns of social justice. We're seeing how the museum online can be an agent of change within the world, that actant that we saw in those lists of users. We're hopeful. We're no longer anguishing in existential angst at our ironic websites. We're hopeful of what we can achieve with our channels and platforms online. We've moved from a question of how to order to a question of what is real, to now it's, well, who's right? Who has agency? Let's be part of those questions around knowledge creation. We've moved from that modernist catalogue to that postmodernist collage to today, yeah, that meta-modernist era of community. That's our critical maturity. And what's so interesting, as a final comment to say on this, what is so interesting looking across that is, as I said before, it's not just a story that explains the evolving museum and it's the art museum's relationship with technology, but that, what you're looking at there, is also a story of the museum in society and the impact of society on the museum. We begun by talking about 2020. Let's own that metaphor. Rather than it being awkward that we felt that we haven't had 2020 vision in this last year, as I say, let's take ownership of that metaphor, that trope. Let's enjoy taking the long view on the history of museums and digital change. Let's confidently have 2020 vision. Thank you very much.